Hello again. You're on Office Hours with the Mad Professor. I had a conversation this morning about the situation between the United States and its NATO allies and Russia, given the recent summit meeting in Europe between Trump and the heads of the other NATO members, and then his upcoming meeting with Vladimir Putin in Helsinki. And it quickly turned to fears of war, that Putin is playing the long game and is trying to engineer things such that he can reoccupy territories of the former Soviet Union. Now, granted, I'm sure he would love to do that, but the reality is he simply can't, and I'll come back to the reason for that. But are there any kind of valid fears here? And, well, it's obvious that there's some actual basis to these kind of fears. Putin does play the long game. Putin is a major geopolitical chess player. He is a master manipulator. And obviously Trump is anything but. He's very easily manipulated by people. You can see that in how well that, Kim Jong-un manipulated him, as well as tons of other people in the past couple of years. So you've also got the reservations that he expresses about NATO. He said during the campaign that the NATO alliance was obsolete in his terms, and he spends a lot of time criticizing democratic allies, the Germans, the Canadians, Mexico, tons of long-standing American friends, and actually then cozies up to tons of dictators, autocrats, strongmen, everyone from Duterte in the Philippines to Kim Jong-un, Vladimir Putin. He's been kissing Xi Jinping's ass as well. So there is some kind of valid fear there that Trump is trying to undermine NATO in favor of his buddy in Moscow. Well, who knows if there's anything actually to their real relationship beyond what we can see publicly, although that in itself is troubling, even if there is no deeper connection. One big question you want to get out of the way here in terms of Trump's approach to NATO is just to explode some of the myths that he himself is responsible for spreading about it. He argues that the U.S. gets a bad deal in NATO, that the Europeans are taking advantage of America because the United States spends so much more money on defense and stations troops in Europe, etc., etc. And he's actually likened it to NAFTA, which he has called the worst deal ever. So he clearly is not a fan of it. And yet it's worth noting that far from being screwed by the Europeans and suckered into paying the bill for Europe's defense, the United States actually drove the creation of NATO, and it has always served American interests and American foreign policy. It made the United States the hegemon in Europe. It put us essentially in charge of European defense, giving us a tremendous amount of leverage over the other European states. It also served our economic interests. The United States had, in a relatively short period of time, been drawn into two major wars in Europe and was determined to avoid this happening again. To do that, it had to end the Franco-German rivalry, get them to be friends, which it did, and establish a framework for lasting peace on the European peninsula, which has definitely been a tremendous advantage to the United States and to the world overall. Today, the Germans and French are married. The idea of actual land war in Europe is unthinkable. The various powers of Europe are so tightly integrated economically that no one could possibly imagine fighting each other again. So it's worth understanding here that both the European Union, ultimately, beginning with the coal and steel community, and NATO were both actually midwifed by the United States, and for American strategic and economic reasons, for our own selfish interest. Trump seems incapable of understanding this. He's like a child when it comes to geopolitics. It's endlessly frustrating. All he sees is the dollar signs. Oh, we're spending money on their defense, therefore we're getting a bad deal. No, we're making so much more money by being able to trade with a peaceful Europe. So, there's that. So let's consider Putin's long game and what Russian interests here are. Well, it is true that Russia does so... My cats. It is true that Russia does work hard to undermine the alliance, that it does push European powers. It interferes in elections there as well as in the United States. It's not just here that the Russians are involved in covert operations and push people around. It has a tremendous incentive to undermine the transatlantic alliance. Well, why? Is it because Russia does want to wage war and take this territory? Well, on the one hand, Putin has referred to the collapse of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. A bit of an exaggeration there, but his words, not mine. And clearly does fetishize the old Soviet period and Soviet power. He would love to have that back. The reality is he's never going to get it. Even places where he could have been involved and has been involved militarily to some extent, he's still refrained from annexing territory. Crimea is the exception, not the rule. Look at South Ossetia or Abkhazia in Georgia, both of which are de facto independent statelets since the 2008 war in Georgia, but not annexed to Russia. Or the Transnistria region in Moldova, which has Russian troops in it and has been de facto independent for a couple of decades now, and yet not annexed. Why? Because if Russia were to annex these territories, it would open itself up to massive economic sanctions. This is not an acceptable approach in contemporary politics. People do not tolerate the annexation of territory by outside powers without passing massive economic sanctions in response. And Russia can ill afford those kind of sanctions. Just consider the basic structure of the Russian economy. The Soviet Union was never a great economic power. At the height of the Cold War, its economy was about the size of Britain's. It was never really a true superpower in anything like the economic sense, the way the United States is. And today, with the loss of so much territory and the collapse of so much industry since the Soviet period, Russia's economy is about the size of Spain's. Hardly one of the greatest powers in the world, and certainly not a great military power. Russia has been modernizing its military, but it still depends upon conscripts. It has terrible discipline problems, massive issues with drunkenness in the military and stealing of equipment. A lot of its military equipment is massively out of date, and it simply cannot afford a large war. Were it to get involved in a large war, it would immediately disrupt trade, it would immediately incur sanctions, and Russia utterly depends upon petrochemical exports, oil and gas, and the arms industry to prop up its entire economy. It really has relatively few actual viable export industries and relatively few sources of foreign currency. It is too dependent upon these. Russia is a petrostate. It's like a large version of Saudi Arabia, I guess. And we tend to forget that. The Russian economy is tiny, its population is shrinking, its military is out of date, and it's utterly dependent upon trade and the sale of arms and oil and gas. A large war makes all of that impossible. So what is it really after? What is the actual long game for Russia? Well, on the one hand, it does seek to sow disunity in Europe. it is to Russia's advantage if Europeans argue with one another, if they fight with one another, if they present a less unified front. Why? Is that because it makes it easier to invade? Well, it would, but that's not really the point here. The key issue is that it erodes support for sanctions and increases support for trade with Russia. It increases Russia's influence in its near abroad. It wants to be able to dominate the former Soviet Union and some of the Soviet Union's former satellites in Eastern Europe. It wants to be a local hegemon again, in the same way that Europe is in Western Europe, and it resents that the United States has advanced into its own territory in Eastern Europe. It deeply resents the movement of NATO up to its borders. It would also love to see a collapse in the democracy and the sort of human rights rhetoric that the Europeans are so into. It would love to see the rise of new forms of autocracy and populist governments, which is why it's such a fan of movements like, well, the populists in Hungary, in Poland, why it props up Lukashenko in Belarus, and Nazarbayev in Kazakhstan. Having autocrats on its borders is a real advantage to Russia because it decreases pressure for Russia to reform and for Russia to democratize. And the more Western Europe falls into that camp, the more it would benefit Russian interests, the more it would increase the potential for Russian arms sales, for Russian economic involvement, for sales. I mean, it's obviously made a big deal out of the pipeline that it's got running through the Baltic to Germany for gas. So Russia does have a long game, and Putin is playing a long game here for influence, but it's not for war for territory. War for territory would not serve Russia's national interests. It would not fit Putin's goals of making Russia a great and respectable power again in any way. It would have exactly the opposite effect. It would undermine and destroy so much of what he's attempted to build in Russia in the first place. So let's think about the summit for a minute. What actually happened when Trump met with NATO? Yes, he did complain a lot. He did, complain on the way up to the summit, and during the summit he berated allies. He had sent strongly worded letters to various allies, as well as making critical comments there. But in this case, Trump's bark is a lot worse than his bite. Because at the end, he did sign the joint declaration from the other NATO members, which included a sharp rebuke of Russia and its foreign policy and its annexation of Crimea. So he had to sign on to some sharp criticism of his buddy Putin. And he did reaffirm the United States' commitment to the common defense in NATO, which was a huge fear. A lot of his comments have left Europeans deeply unsettled. It's greatly increased support for the French initiative for a rapid reaction force that's entirely European and sort of divorced from the American involvement in the Joint Command. So he has rattled a lot of our allies and certainly given Putin reason to be happy, but at the end, still stuck with the alliance. Now, he has pushed them on defense spending, which is an interesting question. The United States spends a bit over 3% of its GDP on the military, which, given the size of the U.S. economy, is a fantastic amount of money, an absolutely absurd amount of money, given we have no actual significant threats to our territory. But set that aside. There was a agreement worked out under Obama before that the European allies would gradually move toward spending 2% of their GDP on the military. Several European countries already meet that. If I remember right, Estonia does, Britain does, I think France does. There's only a handful that actually do. Most are a bit under 2%, and some are actually just barely over 1%. The German and Italian defense spending is barely over 1%, which again, given the size of their economies, is quite low. And yet this has not stopped the Germans from participating in military actions overseas in support of American objectives. There are Germans fighting in Helmand province in Afghanistan and have been for many years. So it certainly doesn't stop their ability to project force when necessary, but they could easily spend more money. Not content with pushing them to meet that obligation of 2% by 2024, Trump absurdly suggested that they should actually get up to 4%, which the U.S. doesn't even match. It makes no sense at all. Especially since, in military terms, there are no really credible threats. The United States should actually cut back a lot of its defense spending. Europe should spend a bit more than it does, but it certainly doesn't need to spend vastly more than it does on the military, even to continue to deter Russia and support it. What it does is it allows for foreign interventions and whatnot. And the more you obviously have a large force like that ready to go, the more that policymakers are tempted to use it, and then the next thing you know, we get involved in intervention wars and regime changes and everything, all that sort of thing. And I'm clearly not a fan of that sort of thing. They tend not to work out very well. So I'm sort of skeptical of this whole attempt to raise defense spending. But it is at least a valid criticism and would continue to send the message to Russia that the alliance is secure, which again serves American interests and helps the American economy and everything else. So there's my reflections here on the summit. If you enjoy these videos, remember to hit the little subscribe button, and I'll see you again some other time.